Good morning. Hello. Welcome to a new week. Welcome to another weekly update. Lots of interesting things to talk about, which is good because actually quite often August is a really quiet month. And certainly some of the podcasts I've been listening to that cover some of the tech news in other places, apart from kind of the Microsoft space, talking about it being kind of quiet, lots of stuff not happening, and it can be hard sometimes to fill those podcasts with interesting news. Anecdotally, actually, I've heard that, so Microsoft often, like lots of the tech companies, tend to close down over August. Anecdotally, I've kind of heard that's not quite true this year. This year's a bit different, and that's kind of the Copilot effect, I think, and all of the stuff that's been happening there, which is interesting. Funnily enough, wasn't really the plan, but we're actually going to talk about lots of AI stuff today. And like I say, it didn't really work out like that. But perhaps everybody's trying to get their holidays in before the Copilot stuff lands. Hey, Graham. Yeah, absolutely. Like, it does seem like lots of people on multiple holidays, and I'm guilty of that as well. I think it's maybe we're still in like a post-COVID thing. I don't know. Maybe people are kind of getting back and thinking about what they've missed and spending some of that money they've saved. I don't know. It's interesting. But yeah. Anyway, we are. All the things I'm going to talk about today are AI related, and like I say, that wasn't really the plan. It's just the way it worked out. So, first thing I want to talk about is a blog post on the dev blogs, the Microsoft dev blogs blog, all about AI pair programming. And this is kind of interesting on a couple of different levels. So you might be a program already, and this is going to be like a relatively basic app, and you'll probably already know how to do this if you're a Teams developer. This is interesting because in it, Rabia builds this app using Copilot, so GitHub Copilot. And so it can be interesting for you if you're already a developer in the space to see how you might use Copilot in interesting ways. But also if you're not a developer in this space and maybe you want to be, then that's interesting as well, because it can really help you, right? It can you can see this stuff and you can see how to use Copilot, how to use the AI to help you do programming and help you get into programming and start programming. Absolutely. So let's get started looking at this blog post because I think it's interesting. So I think this is kind of cool because if you go down this list, Rabia goes into just, first of all, getting started, how to start some things up, how to set it up. So if you've never done it for the first time, the bit I want to get into really and show you is down here somewhere, blah, 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 where, all that stuff up to there was like, okay, let's just set up the IDE, let's set up the experience for building apps and how we get going with apps. And then Rabia goes into adding the Copilot extension. And then things get interesting because, she's got some example where she needs to create an array. And so she's telling us the prompts that she gives to GitHub Copilot to do that stuff. So these aren't necessarily things I would have thought of asking Copilot to do. Create an array of products, make that with the length 3 and the properties, blah, blah, blah. Just kind of, spew it out. Stuff like that actually is a big time saver. I often go to Stack Overflow to look up the syntax of stuff because I know how to do it. It's the itty bitty syntax that I sometimes kind of get confused about because I'm not doing it every day. If it's like a different language, language I'm not used to, or a million other things, right? I think so. I think this is interesting. I think there's a whole conversation we should have at some point about whether or not Copilot by itself can make a non-programmer into a programmer. There's an assumption here in this blog post that you need to make an array, and that's kind of like a deeper thing. But leaving that aside for the moment, I think this is exactly what it says on the tin. It's a Copilot to a developer, right? And I think, but having said that, I do think that can help people who are getting into development get better at development. So I think there's a few things to that. But I think this is interesting. It's export the products array, yep. And then, blah, blah, blah. And then this is a kind of an interesting prompt, right? Create an asynchronous API service to return product searching to return product, searching the products array by name, not case sensitive, and includes string. So like there's a bunch of like stuff you put on the end of these prompts, but like, I mean, I guess that looks like it's going to work more or less. So I think the stuff is interesting. So there's two different reasons to go look at this blog post. One is if you're already a developer and you just want to understand how Copilot, sort of GitHub Copilot specifically, can help you do better. And then the other one is, you know, if you're getting into development and you just want to understand this stuff more and you want to just see how Copilot might help you get to grips with stuff. But I think just underlining that, I think, again, the naming here is good. It's co-piloting, it's not piloting. And I think that's probably an interesting, but an important distinction to make. All right, let's go somewhere weird for a minute because I saw this over the weekend and it's pretty weird. So there's a new, so Microsoft Research, obviously well known for doing lots of things, interesting things, and they've definitely been looking at AI for a while. There's a new paper out around a new large language model that I thought was really interesting. It's called Gorilla, which is a silly name, but it's a large language model that is based around looking at APIs rather than, you know, APIs to form a language model around the language of APIs, right? Sounds weird. The idea is if you can make a large language model that understands what APIs look like, that understands what the documentation of APIs look like and the syntax and understand what those APIs do, then you can have a very powerful generalized API model where you can ask it stuff and it can go and figure out how to answer those questions with its knowledge of APIs. And so that's what Microsoft Research has been working on. This language model is called Gorilla and it outperforms GPT-4 in API call generation, which is a sort of very specific niche. This is being done in partnership with UC Berkeley and yeah, there's a whole write-up on WinBuzzer about it, which is interesting. It's, I don't know, I think this is kind of one to watch. I do think this is interesting. Like, you can kind of see how a language model that knows lots about APIs could be really, really powerful, especially if it can figure out from documentation how to call those APIs. It doesn't need lots of introduction to the APIs. It might be able to go and find APIs that you didn't know existed. There's a lot going on there. So I think that's kind of interesting, honestly, and definitely worth a watch. If you don't want to read this whole blog post, that's fine, because there's another link in here as well you could look at, which is this one, which is, I mean, I don't know what to call this really. It's a 5-minute promo video for Gorilla that features it's 5 minutes long and it features 5 minutes of stock videography because of course, and special effects, because of course there's nothing really to show at this point. There's no real kind of output of this stuff, but there's lots of gorillas and there's lots of futuristic looking stuff, but it does quite a good job of explaining what it actually is and what it does. So you might find that interesting. Yeah, I think this is one to watch. I'm not quite sure where it's going to go, whether it's going to go into the Microsoft Copilot stuff, whether it's going to form part of Azure AI. That might be a more natural place for it to go, whether it's going to become its own application, its own thing. Who knows? All right, but I think it's interesting. So that's definitely one to watch. All right, let's look at something else. And this one, let me just check what this is. Yes, okay, fine. So there's a new, a blog post by Laura Graham Brown, who owns the Hatful of Data blog, which is a great blog all about Power BI stuff or Power Automate stuff, Power Platform stuff, really, all of Power Platform. And there's often good Power BI tips and tricks in there. There's often Power Automate tips and tricks in there. And in this blog post, she's talking about how to use Power Automate to basically write Power Automate. So there's a feature in Power Automate called Write Me a Flow, which I think was kind of cool. And it's kind of AI, but it doesn't require a Copilot license, which is cool. And so here we go. So I like these blog posts because Laura says in the intro, like this was a demo she's putting together for or she would have put together for Scottish Summit 23, which is always good to like turn into blog posts because they solve a particular problem quite quickly. So this is kind of cool. So there's a whole YouTube video about it you can go and watch. But this is kind of, you can just basically tell it what you want to do, click the button, and it will try and write a flow for you. I think by the reading kind of between the lines is that it needs to be fairly simple. But if you want to get started, if you don't know what Power Automate is, if you're just trying to understand how it works, but you know the thing you want to do, this is absolutely worth giving a go. So look for this describe it icon and give it a go and see if it can do it. So Laura goes into detail around what you have to do after you've described, how to check it, how to set up the connections. But that might be worth looking at if you want to get into Power Automate as well. Or even if you're in Power Automate, I often use Power Automate to kind of solve small problems that would be a bit of a pain to break out some code for, because then you've got to babysit and look after the code somewhere. So any kind of, I suppose it's kind of places where traditionally, before everything was in the cloud, you might have relied on scripts. So and just scripts to kind of glue bits of data together and stuff like that. Just automate some things. One thing happening over here needs to action another thing happening over here. So for that, I find Power Automate very useful for cloud workloads. So yeah, I'm going to try this because if it saves a couple of minutes on creating a flow, and that happens, multiple times a month, those savings add up, and that's all good. Okay, another blog post to tell you about, one by Jamie Maguire this time, and he's kind of, I did see this happen, and I didn't really talk about it at the time, so it's good to have a blog post to refer to, and Jamie goes into a good level of detail, tabling everything below. But there's been some renaming of some of the AI workloads in Azure, or what were previously cognitive services workloads and stuff like that. They're all now called AI services, which is kind of not a surprise if you've been kind of watching the landscape. Everything has been bundled into Azure AI services. So that includes bot services, it includes cognitive search. Weirdly, it includes the video indexer part of Azure Media Services. Obviously, it includes OpenAI, and it includes those other cognitive services workloads. Immersive Reader's a stretch, I think, but whatever. Anyway, this is a cool table. There's now like a table that tells you what the things used to be called and what they're now called, and everything on the right-hand side has the word AI in it, I think. Yeah, pretty much. Oh, apart from Azure Cognitive Search, which is weird because, well, whatever. Yes. All right. So I think this is kind of a good thing. I think it's useful. It's helpful. It's one of those renaming things that needs to happen. But like I say, probably not a surprise, but it happened during Inspire. And like I said, I saw it go past, but I didn't really sort of pay much attention to it. But it's good to have a full table for us to refer to. So thanks, Jamie, for that. Helpful. All right. Last thing I want to tell you about is more of a kind of long read than kind of just technical detail or news or anything. It's a blog post from the kind of Microsoft, not the dev side, more of the kind of enterprisey, the corporate side, and it's by the VP of Microsoft Teams. And it's all about using AI for frontline workers. So frontline, first line, whatever you want to call them, and how AI can assist those. Most of this I'm going to skip over because it's not, some of it's technical, but not a lot of it. A lot of it is kind of less techie. There's an interesting bit I just want to jump down to though in the blog post and just talk through from a tech perspective, which is... So the first example they give of how Microsoft are bringing AI to frontline workers is in shifts. And what's interesting is there isn't going to be a Copilot for shifts in the way that there is for other things, but there's going to be a shifts plugin for Copilot. And this is an interesting differentiation for me. So lots of the big Microsoft 365 services we've already heard are going to have Copilot in them. So, Copilot for Word, Copilot for Power BI, Copilot for Teams, whatever it's going to be, they're going to have Copilot in them. Some of the smaller products that, things like Shifts, it's not a standalone product. It lives inside Teams. It doesn't make sense for it to have its own Copilot. But in what Microsoft is doing is creating a plugin for their first party experience to work alongside Copilot. And this is good. It's good for two reasons. Firstly, I think it's good because they're using the same plugin technology and the same plugin system, hopefully. I mean, we've yet to see any of this stuff, but I'm hoping they're using the same plugin mechanism that developers are going to have access to. That's always good because it means that plugin system is going to stay up to date. It's going to get its bugs fixed. If there's edges, they're going to get smoothed off because Microsoft are also using it themselves, and that always drives better sort of performance. And that's not just a Microsoft thing, that's a company thing everywhere. If you have an API for your product, for your service, you should use that in your first party products, because otherwise, it's too tempting to let that API lag behind because it's not core to your success. Whereas if you build your products on your API is always up to date. So that's good. But also, I think it's just interesting. It's going to be a good model for developers to follow as well as they're building their plugins. And I talked quite a bit about building plugins for Copilot last time. So I don't want to go over it again now. But I thought that was interesting. I thought it was useful. All good. And there's some other things in this blog post as well. Other examples of how AI is coming to first line. This is less AI, but talking about announcements in Viva connections coming. So announcements are coming to tablet and mobile experiences in September. That's interesting. Some other things going on there as well. Targeted campaigns of Viva Engage. Again, this is moving slightly away. We're coming back to kind of AI with Copilot and Engage. Coming later this year. Kind of, again, we don't really have dates for Copilot. But the kind of consistent thing we do keep hearing is that it's probably this year. So learn more about Copilot and Viva coming later this year. So we don't know exactly when that's going to be. I did a blog post a couple of weeks ago about the investor call, talking about that being in H2, which is I think it's H2. But anyway, it's kind of the January to June timeframe. But that's for revenue recognition. So kind of a GA towards the end of this year does kind of make sense. Some other stuff around kind of trusted experience and blah, blah, blah. So it's a long blog post, but there's quite a lot of information in it. But the bit I really wanted to talk to you and just mention and call out really was that stuff, about plugins, because it looks like Microsoft are going to use the plugin model to bolster their kind of smaller products and services that don't have, where it doesn't make sense for them to have their own dedicated Copilot thing going on. So lots of AI to talk about this week. Kind of probably not a surprise, I guess, but still interesting. I hope it's been useful. Probably. A slight deviation, I suppose, from what I normally talk about, but it's quiet time. And honestly, this is the stuff that's happening right now in our space. Like, it is all about Copilot at the moment. It's all about AI. It's about building plugins for those AIs. And that is where the engineering investment is going. And that's where the marketing buzz is going. And so I think that's probably where the developers need to go as well. And it'd be interesting to see how that stuff works out. All right. That is everything from me. I hope you have a great week, whatever it is you're doing, and I will speak to you again next time.